He said his action was inevitable. After 6.5 years in power, Mikhail Gorbachev confirmed his resignation on television tonight.
Я покидаю свой пост с тревогой, но и с надеждой, с верой в вас, в вашу мудрость и силу духа. Мы наследники великой цивилизации, и сейчас от всех и каждого зависит, чтобы она возродилась к новой, современной и достойной жизни.
Two countries, two men with an idea for peace after decades of hostility. This is how and why the United States and the USSR reconstructed their relationship in the 1980s. On July 17, 1945, the Potsdam Conference began in Potsdam, Germany. The three big leaders, U.S. President Truman, newly elected British Prime Minister Attlee, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, met to discuss the end of World War II. This conference, which lasted until August, divided Germany into the French zone, the American zone, the British zone, and the Soviet zone, which would later divide Berlin and form the Berlin Wall. The atomic bomb was tested and would later be used by Americans to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. A few days later, the Japanese surrendered. President Truman, who had taken office just after President Roosevelt's death, felt uncomfortable with the USSR's large military power. He, like many other Americans, caught the Red Scare, or the fear of communists and communist powers. During the Potsdam Conference, the idea of the atomic bomb was introduced, and a few weeks later, the United States decided to bomb the Japanese. Stalin did not agree to this type of bombing and stated that using the atomic bomb is a super barbarity. The war ended so quickly after the mentioning of the atomic bomb that the USSR got the impression that the United States did not want the USSR to have a role in the defeating of the Japanese. The mistrust in both of the nations began the Cold War, a war of no direct violence, but generally of hostility. Senator Arthur Vandenberg said on behalf of the United States, "I am more than ever convinced that communism is on the march on a worldwide scale, which only America can stop." After World War II ended, Germany and Korea were split into capitalist and communist states. These divisions in the government would build a wall in Germany and start a war in Korea. The United States and the USSR would be involved in these wars nonetheless. The two sides had to fight, not directly, but to prove which government would reign, a capitalist nation or a communist nation. The sentiment at the time was also that if one country builds enough weapons to blow up the other, then this country must be the strongest nation in the world. Who would win the race? What are the effects of such a race? Now let's fast forward to the 1980s. We were introduced to MTV, Pac-Man, the internet, and Star Wars. The 80s came from dark days, however. In 1979, the economy collapsed because of an oil crisis in the Middle East when the Iranians revolted against their government. The country needed a president who could actually lead the country. Not Jimmy Carter, not Richard Nixon, but Ronald Reagan. He was elected in 1980 by a landslide margin. His election was known as the Reagan Revolution. His efforts, along with Gorbachev's, would end the Cold War. But first, let us look at the man who would do all of this. On February 6, 1911, Ronald Reagan was born in Tampico, Illinois, to Jack and Nellie Reagan. He went to Dixon High School and spent his time lifeguarding at Rock River, Illinois. After he graduated from Eureka College, he began his career as an actor. He starred in The King's Row, the movie that would make him famous. He portrayed a man who had a disability. During his acting career, he met Nancy Davis, the woman he would marry. When he was married to her, he found himself becoming more and more conservative. He was an advocate for anti-communism and campaigned for Barry Goldwater in 1964.
Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war. But there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second. Remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny. Thank you very much.
In 1966, Ronald Reagan decided to quit his acting career and move on to politics by running for governor of California. On January 3, 1967, he became governor of California and fulfilled his dream of becoming a politician. Then in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president. In his first term as president, he ordered for the escalation of the arms race, believing that the Soviet Union simply couldn't produce as many weapons as the United States could. Reagan still believed that the USSR was the evil empire. This sentiment would later change when Mikhail Gorbachev took office in 1985 as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. On March 2, 1931, Gorbachev was born. Gorbachev grew up in a small town near Stavropol. His dad was a local Communist Party official. Being a part of the Communist Party is different from being a part of the Democratic or Republican parties. Being a part of the Communist Party means instant power, so only few were qualified. Gorbachev's dad, being a local politician, gave Gorbachev a leg up in his pursuit to become a member of the Communist Party. Gorbachev went to Moscow State University and climbed up the Communist Party ladder along with Yuri Andropov, who was also General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. By this point, the USSR had gained land in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. Corruption was beginning to rise in the USSR. Black markets were being formed, and alcoholism was growing because of the boredom of people's lives. Gorbachev had ideas for reform that he could only use if he became General Secretary of the USSR. These ideas were known as perestroika, reform, and glasnost, transparency. When he became General Secretary in 1985, he enacted the policies quite quickly. The first time Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met was at the Geneva Summit in Geneva, Switzerland. They discussed such topics as SDI, an anti-missile system that would destroy missiles from space, advocated by Ronald Reagan, and the keeping of Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Angola, advocated by Mikhail Gorbachev. The two didn't agree on anything, so the meeting was somewhat pointless. However, they did meet each other, and they did talk about peace. The next summit that Reagan and Gorbachev had was the Reykjavik Summit. The Reykjavik Summit was a few months after the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion, which the Soviet press released a month after the event actually occurred. This weakened the Soviet Union's name thus further, but Gorbachev wanted to remain on top. He pleaded for no SDI and hinted to Reagan about the idea of nuclear weapon reduction. They made huge progression in their relationship, but didn't make conclusive agreements at this summit. In between U.S.-Soviet summits, Reagan gave a speech at the Berlin Wall, calling on Gorbachev to save humanity and demanded,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The third and most important summit, though there were more to come, was the Washington Summit of 1987. At this summit, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which declared that nuclear weapons of an intermediate range would be eliminated from both governments. The nuclear arms race between the USSR and the United States subsided. The nuclear arms race, which had threatened both countries for decades, ended, making the summits that Reagan and Gorbachev had a turning point in the Cold War. In 1991, Reagan's wish for the Berlin Wall to come down was granted. As for Gorbachev, he became president of the USSR for only a year, until his own people revolted against his policies, perestroika and glasnost, making him resign, and the USSR was no more.
You and I in a little toy shop, buy a bag of balloons with the money we've got. set them free.